Hello, my name is Greg Jones, and I'm doing a research proposal presentation for our research and evaluation course. For my proposed study, I chose to do muscle contractile velocity, or as it is also known, rate of force development, and how this may be a determinant for maximal speed potential. As I'm sure many of us are aware of, attributes such as strength, power, and speed are all highly desired in the sports industry world. Speed, for example, is particularly a very sought after trait in athletes, especially in the NFL. Now, when we're talking about speed, it is important to note that there is a lot of variables which influence a person's ability to run very fast. Some of these variables may include muscle capacity. It might be biomechanically related. There's somebody's ability to limit their lateral displacement. Also, even something like length of levers and the proportion to one another, such as your femur to your tibia, could even influence, at least slightly, somebody's capacity to run very fast. Now, another thing that's important to point out when analyzing speed is the fact that there's different phases to speed. So even though my study is focusing on determinants for maximal speed, that doesn't mean we could ignore, completely the fact that there's an acceleration phase prior to getting to top end speed. So the acceleration phase has, you can see in the image right here, it has a lot of distinctions when compared with the top end speed phase. For example, in the acceleration phase, your angle is going to be a lot lower. As you can see in the top end speed phase, it looks like the person is practically upright. You have a 90-degree angle with the femur and the upper body, whereas in the acceleration phase, they're at about a 45-degree angle there. Another thing that's important to point out when analyzing speed is the power aspect. It's kind of a traditional scope of looking at speed. If you've ever taken physics, which I'm sure all of us have, maybe you recall this formula: power equals force times velocity. I think typically it's power equals work over time, but after a couple conversions you could get this formula, and this formula is actually a little bit easier to apply to real world scenarios, at least in sports. And so with this formula, a lot of times what strength and conditioning coaches do is they take the force part of the formula and translate that to strength. The person's strength or ability to move mass would describe force, and then velocity is simply as it is described, a person's ability to move from point A to point B quickly. The other thing that's interesting though about that formula is that the two variables, force and velocity, they actually are inversely related to one another. So in other words, as force increases, velocity will tend to decrease, or as velocity increases, you tend to compromise some of your force. Now, traditionally, in the strength and conditioning world and training approaches, coaches tend to prioritize strength over velocity, and I think this happens inadvertently because you'll have coaches who design programs which they'll make with the intention of focusing primarily on power. If I go back again to the formula, according to this formula, both velocity and force are equally contributing factors to power. But what ends up happening is because of that inverse relationship, if a coach, for example, has somebody doing, I don't know, 4 reps with 85% of their 1 rep maximum, then although the coach might tell the athlete to move the weight as fast as they can, in efforts or in hopes of simultaneously working the strength aspect by having them lift such a heavy weight, but also they're hoping to work the velocity aspect by telling the athlete to try to push that weight as fast as they can. But of course, because the weight is so heavy, no matter how hard the athlete tries, the weight is not going to move as fast as it would if it was a smaller weight. By the same token, if it was a smaller weight, if it was, let's say, 30% of their 1 rep max, and then the athlete was able to move the weight very fast, then obviously, as far as strength goes, that wouldn't be much of a challenge, and so it would be a lot less likely that form of training would induce strength gain. So that's kind of what coaches have to deal with. But from my experience and from doing studies and looking at the literature, it definitely seems as if coaches tend to prioritize strength and whatever velocity training they could get concurrently while the athlete is lifting heavy, then that's how they'll go about trying to improve power. Now I have these pictures here. Again, hopefully you can see. So we have Deshaun Jackson, Travis Benjamin, Andre DeGrasse, the man Jarvis Landry. I put up this picture because, interestingly enough, I came up with the idea for this study was simply in part because of thinking about these guys and how the body types and their strengths, their speed are so different, and it's interesting because a lot of the difference goes contrary to this idea, that strength is gonna be a strong determinant of power. We got guys like Deshaun Jackson, Travis Benjamin, these two right here. These are athletes that are fairly slim. They're slender. Even as receivers, the positions that they play, wide receiver, you're not typically expected to be the biggest, strongest guys out on the field, but they're definitely small or skinny receivers compared to their peers, but they're amongst the fastest in their professions. And ironically, these two guys over here, they're the same position, and if you could see, their build is a lot more muscular, and they have a lot more mass, and I'd go as far as saying they're a lot stronger than the two guys I mentioned before them. But both of these guys, the strong aspects of their game is not necessarily their speed. Actually, the two more muscular looking guys, they people will probably say they are a lot that's significantly slower than the two slim guys. But that just goes to show how that whole mindset that strength is a big determinant of speed doesn't necessarily seem to hold true. Even with a guy like Andre DeGrasse, he's one of the fastest men in the world. He's also very slim. So I just mentioned the practical evidence from the example I just gave with the athletes. Now on the experimental side, there's also a reason to believe that strength is not as good of a determinant for speed as maybe strength and conditioning coaches would like to think. There's been studies that have found that the rate of force development is a better determinant to running speed, and if we want to dig a little deeper and maybe find out what mechanisms might contribute to that, the first thing that should come to mind is muscle fiber types. So we have your type 1 muscle fibers and your type 2 muscle fibers, and for example, the type 2X muscle fibers in one study showed that it had 4.4 times higher capacity for rate of force development, and type 2A muscle fibers had 3 times the rate of force development capacity than type 1. So both of those, type 2X and type 2A, both have way more muscle contractile velocity capabilities compared to type 1 muscle fibers. And so what that should tell you is that a lot of programs or training methods should look beyond the strength scope. Of course, strength is still something that is beneficial for athletes, but when you're trying to optimize an athlete's potential for speed, you want to not limit them in any way. You don't want to hinder them by trying to kill two birds with one stone, get strength and some speed, but you might actually be getting far less speed improvements compared to what you could get if you treated them as two separate attributes. And so the purpose of the study was to do just that, to try to distinguish between the benefits that athletes can get from training in a manner which is more specific to rate of force development, instead of trying to work on power via strength and velocity. And so when I was doing my study, my research, I was doing my research, I came to realize, or I came across a study that was very interesting, and it mentioned that when training for rate of force development specifically, an application of just as low as 10% yielded some benefits for performance in regards to speed, and so that kind of coincides with what I was alluding to before, that speed training or rate of force development training should be done somewhat independently of strength, because by doing so you're really able to train those mechanisms which will help develop the velocity, or your muscles and your neurons' ability to signal for the muscles to fire rapidly. Now, another practical uh, conceptualization that helped me out with thinking of this study, came in the form of fighters. I was thinking about Bruce Lee and Floyd Mayweather, and how these guys, they have some fast hands. Like, their abilities to throw punches is phenomenal. Or, well, Bruce Lee, his ability to throw punches was phenomenal. But yeah, the rate at which they're able to contract the muscles that are involved in that movement is highly impressive. But the reason this relates to my study was because I came to realize, well, if these guys, they're training their ability to punch with a lot of velocity by doing fast movements with no added weight, no load, on their arms. It's not like they're throwing punches with 10-pound dumbbells taped to their arms or anything. They're just, as you can see with the speed bag over here, they're just practicing the movements over and over. But when they're doing the movements, they're doing it at such a high velocity. It coincides with the training principles specificity. So the body, it adapts. Your neurons, I guess they as one of the studies, it was actually by Michael Zordo's, Dr. Zordo. He has, in the studies that he did a couple years back, it showed that you could actually train at high velocities with lower loads, and you're gonna promote a conversion of muscle fiber type. So you'll have type 1 muscle fibers that can be converted, or at least behave as if they were type 2 muscle fibers. And yeah, you can definitely have conversion of those fibers, but with the right type of training. You have to have a substantial amount of training. But the studies, like I said, Zordo study, I think this was, this was the one with Zordo's. In that study, they found that you could have muscle fiber conversion that occurs by doing maximal contractile type of training. So real quick, so my study, I wanted to break off two groups. One group that would work specifically on the rate of force production type of approach to training, and then another group I want to have doing the DUP, daily undulating periodization type of format. And in that group, they would basically work on strength and power in the weight room. That'd kind of be like the control group doing the more traditional approach of training, and then the experimental group would be the ones that are doing velocity specific type work. By that group, as far as velocity specific type work, some of the workouts that I would have them doing is, for example, hip thrusters, but a variation of that, a single legged hip thruster with a band attached at the bottom, right there, and that would be in, just to provide that slight load. In the literature, it was between 10% to 20% is what they found to be, of your 1 rep max, is what they found to be optimal for inducing the beneficial adaptations that come from velocity training. So so the independent variables in my study would be the rate of force development training, and also the DUP training, and then the dependent variable would be the speed, the top end speed. And as far as testing, the testing would be done with the 40-yard dash. It's not, I don't believe it's the most valid test for football speed, but it would provide us a base, a point of orientation, something to compare both groups by, and how we would try to make those results have more validity to them. And reliability would be by using Dartfish Express. It's a video analyzation app, and I've used it in the past for my training, and it basically, I would set up cameras at the 20, 30, and 40 yard markers, and have the athletes run their 40-yard dash, and then we could go back, play the video, and go frame by frame and see at what point the athlete's waist passes the 20-yard line, for example. And then the video analyzation program allows you to have a stopwatch feature, which will time from the point where we wanted to time at that first frame where they hit the 20-yard mark, and then time the elapsed duration from that point to when they get to the 30-yard line, and then repeat that from the 30 to the 40. Whichever 10-yard split is the fastest is what we would use as their top end speed, and then we would use that information from the base test, prior to them participating in the program design, and then they would be tested again 6 weeks later after their program, and we'd run the appropriate statistical analysis and regression, and be able to compare to see if there's any significance differences or improvements that occurred either with the DUP training format or with the rate of force development training program. And my references, and that's about it. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.